Seattle News Weekly from Fox 13.
Welcome into another episode of Seattle News Weekly. And this week, I'm here with reporter AJ Janavel because we want to talk about a big story, which is the budget, politics, and Olympia and all the things coming down from it this week. And it made headlines because there is one lawmaker who, reporter AJ Janavel was there covering this, but Representative Sean Scott talked about how he wants to help balance the budget. And one of the things he talked about was the issue of the payroll tax, right? So when you hear taxes, you know, people love it, some people hate it, and that's why I wanted to bring in AJ to bring in some insight to talk about kind of not only actually what he is saying he wants to do, but the vibe that was at that press conference. It was interesting because it kind of got a little tense there with some reporters asking, in my opinion, some obvious questions.
Sure. Clearly,
Representative Sean Scott didn't like those questions, and his answers were kind of interesting. So break it down for us. Like, what was your perspective on this payroll tax? Give the people, if they're just, they're just hearing about this, what is it? It's a 5% tax on salaries of $125,000, right? They're going to tax anything that exceeds that, and he believes it's going to generate billions of dollars every year, right?
Yeah, the focus is going after business and corporation and trying to find dollars that the state desperately needs. And from Representative Sean Scott's perspective, some of the biggest employers in the state could be the ones to make up that budget deficit that we're seeing. And you're thinking about, who are the biggest employers in town? You have Amazon, you have Microsoft, you have these businesses that bring in a lot of money. And so his point of view is they're making the money. Let's see if they can help us to make up that deficit. And you're talking about some of the questions that are asked, because when it comes to taxes, you said some people like them. I don't know if anybody likes them, but they're necessary, right? You need money. You need to pay for things. And the concern would be if you start taxing the biggest employers in the state, what happens if they pick up and leave? And we've seen that already. We've seen businesses not just leave the Seattle area, but we also saw a direct reference to the possibility of state tax. You brought it up. There were other reports that the bigwigs at Microsoft said if the state starts taxing business, we have no issues leaving. So the concern is if you start taxing these businesses and they get up and leave, not only will you not get the tax dollars that you're hopeful for, but now we don't have jobs. And so that's what the other side is saying. You think you're going to get this money, but if we lose our employers, well, you're not gonna have anything now.
Yeah, and so you just brought it up too. You said that this was imposed and then Amazon moved. I believe that's what you just said. But you're talking about that the city of Seattle imposed a payroll tax. So we do have a model to go after, right? So they did this, and the critics of that are saying, look, when the city of Seattle imposed it, Amazon took thousands of jobs, moved them across the water to Bellevue because they were trying to avoid this. And then Seattle didn't end up getting the money that they were projecting. I believe that's what you're talking about. And so what I was hearing is the questions of, okay, if we do this statewide, is it going to happen statewide? Is that kind of the question that people were asking that day of Sean Scott?
Yeah, I think so you got to imagine, right? It's a press conference.
Yeah.
And so Representative Sean Scott has a gaggle of people in support. They're standing on the Capitol steps, and it's this kind of picturesque, typical press scene with the representative up front with dozens of members of tech, former members of tech saying, we got to start targeting these businesses. So that's their side. And then on the other side, you had some reporters who were asking the questions in opposition. So Representative Sean Scott says, we're going to go after these businesses. We're going to have them pay their fair share. That's only right. And then you have reporters asking the questions of what if we lose these businesses?
Right.
So not only do you not get your tax dollars, but you lose employers.
Interesting. So we do have one exchange here that we want to play. If we could play that, you're going to hear from Representative Sean Scott. But first, the reporter question. So take a listen to this.
Companies like Meta, Microsoft, these big guys don't bring in workers for those more lucrative paying jobs because of your suggested tax. So they're only bringing in low wage jobs, and the other ones are out of the state. Then the tax revenue you wish to create from this tax won't exist.
Can I ask a question about which outlet you report for?
The Center Square. I said that when I asked you the first question.
Thank you very much. And have you reported at all on AI in the last year or couple of years? Not so much. Okay, so when
Is that meant to be insulting?
No. It's directly relevant to the question that you're asking, because when I hear people talking about concerns around jobs being shed, which is a very that's.
Can you answer my questions?
I will answer it. I will answer it absolutely. When I hear people voice concerns about jobs that might be shed, which is a very important question. There are many deindustrialized communities throughout Washington State that have been hit very hard by corporations that did decide to relocate because they didn't want to pay what they owed in taxes. But then I don't hear any concerns around the fact that many of these corporations are actively investing in technology that is designed to divest from human labor. That strikes me as incredibly disingenuous, because what it shows is that many corporations are doing the job shedding on their own volition. So if we're not applying the same scrutiny that we have to those business practices which are designed to divest from human labor, but we are talking about tax policy which is going to fund people that are here, people that are contributing to the tax base, people that want to be in Washington State, what that tells me is that that's actually more pro-corporate propaganda than it is an actual question. Next question.
I'm ready for you to answer my question.
Next question.
You did not.
I do have a general question about the budget. Well, actually, Carlene, do you want to get your question answered?
I would appreciate you answering my question. I said, so if your tax is implemented,
right,
then these companies like Meta, Amazon, they're not going to want to locate the higher paying jobs here.
Right.
They'll locate them elsewhere, and they might still keep their lower wage earners here. Then
Right.
your tax isn't going to create the wealth that you are saying it's going to create.
Right.
Can you speak to that?
Yeah, well, there's a trade-off in all policymaking discussions. At present, the unfortunate reality is that we rely mostly on property and sales taxes in Washington State, which is to say those are people who are actively contributing to the tax base in Washington.
Okay. So you heard that exchange there, and if you missed it, I know the reporter's voice was a little low, but that was Carlene Johnson, veteran, reporter in this market. She was basically asking, like, hey, look, if your tax is imposed, right, what do you say to the narrative that it is going to prevent companies like Meta, these big tech companies, from locating high-paying jobs? And when we talk about high-paying, of course, it's all subjective because it's more expensive here than it is in another city. So we're talking about $125,000, right, that he wants to tax above that. So I do want to repeat that number again. What was your perspective on, kind of that back and forth?
Yeah, so from the reporters who were asking questions in opposition, was very much a business forward kind of question and answer. The folks were asking questions that were more pro-business, which makes sense.
Sean Scott called the question pro-corporate propaganda.
Sure, and Representative Sean Scott is very much seemingly, how can I word this? This is my words, but anti-big business in the sense that if you're not going to help out the state, he doesn't mind if you get out of town. One of the biggest questions, and I know we've already talked about this, but this is kind of the one-to-one thing, is if we tax big business and they leave, where are we now? And that was asked, and Representative Scott said something to the effect of, these businesses are already leaving. We've already lost hundreds and thousands of jobs in Washington from employers like Microsoft. His words are, expect to lose even more with AI. I mean, in the summer, you had all of these Microsoft layoffs. So if you have Microsoft who says, we're going to take jobs away from Washington State if you tax us, meanwhile, they're already taking jobs away from Washington State without the taxes. What's the push here? So Representative Scott's saying, hey, man, I'm not going to let business define what I'm going to do. And then again, to mention, you and I talk about this, he is a Democrat, but he's a Democratic socialist, more progressive than just a Democrat. So when a business says we're going to leave, I don't think Representative Sean Scott's the person that's going to, be crying as they pack up and leave the state. Now, on the other side, more conservative side, business is what we need. It's what makes our cities grow. It's what brings in more and more people to the community. It's what makes a place like Seattle a destination spot for some of the biggest tech companies, some of the smartest minds. And so if you have places like Microsoft and Amazon threatening to bail out and maybe make some other city the new tech hub of America, that is very concerning.
Yeah, one thing too I want to bring up now because it goes perfectly to what Representative Scott was talking about that day. So Representative Scott had a press conference middle of the day, and then we heard that Governor Ferguson was having a press conference, but it wasn't about what Scott was talking about. It was regarding the DOJ lawsuit against the Secretary of State's office. So he called this press conference. We're going to talk about, or at least talking about that, and also certifying the election, right? So that was more about the election that Governor Ferguson was talking about.
Right, that was the point of
That
this.
was the point of the press conference. I wanted to set it up so people aren't thinking that this was a press conference about
Correct.
Scott. However, of course, that day reporters were asking Governor Ferguson what he thought about it, right?
Within
it's
literal feet, like the
Right.
stairs of the Capitol
Yeah.
and the governor's conference room are with it. You could see them through the window.
Yeah, so I want to play that sound specifically on Governor Ferguson reacting when he was asked that question about what he thinks about this payroll tax. So here it is.
I haven't seen this proposal. First I've heard about this proposal. What I'd say is, one thing I do know is that any potential revenue stream like that doesn't solve the budget shortfall we're trying to solve for this next year, right? That we have a multi-billion-dollar shortfall this next year. I want to be clear, not even looking out multiple years. And so by the time you get revenue like that in the door, it doesn't solve your problem that's right in front of us, which again is a multi-billion-dollar shortfall. So happy to take a look at that when that proposal comes around. I've not seen it specifically, haven't spoken to him about it. My focus is trying to balance a budget for this next year in particular. There's a multi-billion-dollar shortfall, and that is requiring and will require some additional very challenging decisions. I can assure all of you of that. So we're working as hard as we can to get that done. We'll probably be rolling out different budgets at different times. You'll see, for example, transportation earlier than the operating budget, but there's still, we just had a meeting right here about an hour ago. There's a lot of still difficult decisions ahead of us. But again, the main thing I really want to emphasize, which is important, is, there's going to be a lot of conversations from legislators about a lot of different ideas, I'm sure, on revenues like there were last year. But it's important to keep in mind for balancing our budget for the year that's ahead of us, none of those dollars come in time to balance that this is going to be a challenging budget with a multi-billion-dollar shortfall. Keeping in mind we cut about $8 billion from the budget earlier this year. So as you might imagine, the $9th billion that you're cutting is a lot more challenging to cut than the first $1 billion that you're cutting in a budget like this.
So we have a problem ahead of us as a state because we're talking about billions and billions of dollars in a budget deficit just in 2026. He said multi-billion dollars. So the biggest thing for Governor Ferguson is going to be, what is he going to cut? What is he going to keep? And the push from progressives like Sean Scott to do things like a payroll tax. We've also have progressive Democrats already talking about the possibility of an income tax, expanding the capital gains tax. So their answer to this issue, clearly, and they've said it, clear and simple, it's taxes, is raising new money, right? While maybe you have kind of the more, well, obviously the Republicans completely disagree, but you have moderate Democrats who are saying, oh, wait a second, no, it might have to be that we have to cut some things. What did you get from Governor Ferguson that day? What was the vibe from him? Because last year he said, no, we're not going to get out of this by taxing our way out. But then he did approve a $9 billion tax package that was very controversial for the business community. Sure. This year, it sounds like kind of the same vibe, maybe saying, wait, we can't tax our way out of it. But who knows what his decision is going to be at the end of the day, because he's got a really, really tough budget ahead of him.
And he doesn't know. And that's kind of the trick. And I think you're looking at a two-pronged issue. One's today's problem, the other's tomorrow's problem. Imagine if your kid goes to school without a lunch, you forgot to pack it because you don't have any groceries. And he says, Mom, where's my lunch? And you say, oh, we don't have any groceries. I'll go to the store tonight. And so maybe that'll fix tomorrow's problem. But today your kid still doesn't have food. And so that's where we're at right now, is we have a deficit that needs to be addressed immediately. And even if a tax increase like Representative Sean Scott is suggesting would go into effect, those dollars, from my understanding, wouldn't be received for a long time from now. So even with the tax increase, even if it does get approved, even if they start taxing everywhere, we still got billions of dollars right now that we're in the hole. And so what Governor Ferguson was kind of really focusing on is, I don't know what the fix is, But these tax increases aren't going to be the answer today. And so he's talking about cuts. He's talking about cutting as much as possible. And what he says is, unfortunately, at this point, the easy cuts are gone. We've made those easy decisions. And we're at a point right now where we're going to have to make some really tough ones. And in his own words, he's basically said we're going to be working on this every day until we find an answer. So I think a lot of these clips we're playing are from a few days ago.
And you were there in that room. And,
Right.
and of course, a lot of reporters asked different things, but I think that was really in the top of mind for a lot of reporters.
But
that
what I'm
day.
getting at is I imagine that every single day since he said that, they've been having budget talks. In fact, when we were going into what was supposed to be that certification of the election results, the kind of press event, like, come on in, we're going to sign these,
Right.
we're going to show them up. We couldn't get into that room until a few minutes before it was supposed to start because they were having meetings. And from my understanding, what he said was, these are budget talks.
Well,
And
yeah.
we're going to keep having budget talks.
Of course. I mean, they've been doing it for a while now. You
Right.
have to, right? Because it's one of the biggest issues, and he's talking to everybody. So we'll see what happens. I mean, hopefully we'll hear from him before the end of the year on how he wants to tweak the budget, because it's a 2-year cycle. So he's going to come out and say, this is my idea. So come next year, that's what we're going to be
Sure.
inundated with is, what is the budget? What does he want to cut? And we're going to go back and forth, back and forth. But I don't want to forget the other side in this
Well,
issue, though.
Before, like,
Yeah.
because the question is, right, what are we going to cut? What are
Yeah.
we going to do? And that's a big mystery. But we do have 2 little bits of tangible information. Governor Ferguson saying the transportation budget will be the first thing you see. So you can assume that's a priority if we're going to see that first. He says that later in those interviews. The next question is something that you and I were talking about that day is, well, what do we do? Where do we cut? And we do have a little bit of what at least some Republican lawmakers are suggesting.
Right, because you talked to Chris Corey that day as a representative out of, he represents the Yakima area, Eastern Washington. So what was his idea?
Well, it's interesting, right? Because you have Representative Sean Scott. We went down there. That was the focus. And Representative Corey maybe gave us a bigger answer than we expected. So we actually
do
have
that
clip too. And
Let's
you're going
go
to hear
ahead
exactly what he says if I was making decisions where I would cut.
Okay, so let's listen to that first and we can talk about it.
When you go back and look at the 2025 budget, we cut in a lot of places, but the one place we didn't cut was paying salaries for a lot of our large bargaining associations or bargaining units here in Washington State. They received to the tune of about $4 billion in more money. That is unsustainable, especially when you look at the numbers and show before that raise, they are in 38 out of 39 counties, the highest paid employees on average in those counties. The only exception to that is King, and they're not far behind. This is, unsustainable, and I value our state workers. It's not about that. It is everyone else around the state, including my constituents, myself, and others, are having to tighten their belts, figure out where they can cut. Meanwhile, the state is just saying, well, we're just going to tax people more. The state should have the same approach. Where do we not need to spend money? Where do we need to cut back? And I think that that's the alternative rather than just saying, all right, time to tax more.
Yeah, so there you have it. You talking to him about that. But the reality, though, is, the Republicans are such a minority. They really don't have, at the end of the day, any really voting power, real power when it comes to making things. Things are run by progressive Democrats right now in Olympia. So with that said, what does Representative Corey say to the fact that he can say that, but really do Republicans have any power to change things and influence real legislation here?
Well, what's so interesting, right, is we're now talking about factions within our state's lawmaking branches. And so you have Republicans, you have Democrats, but now you have a newer group, you could say.
Among the Democrats, that
the
are
more
split,
progressive ones. And so it's kind of like a tug of war. Maybe you can't get, as a Republican lawmaker, you can't just band together and say, here we are, it's the Republicans. This is
they don't have the numbers.
Because they don't have the numbers.
Yeah.
But maybe you can find Democrats that maybe lean a little bit more to the right, a more conservative Democrat that says, hey, man, I'm not going to impose a state income tax. It's Washington. That's the one thing that we can hang our hats on is we're not taxing you. Or, no, I agree. I'm a business forward Democratic representative. I helped to bring Microsoft, Amazon, whomever,
Right.
Meta.
Yeah.
I don't want them to go. So it's a balance, and
Right.
it's a game that I don't know,
Yeah.
where you are in there and you kind of think of it maybe like a sports team is like, we're the Republicans and we
Yeah.
go against the Democrats. But now as there's offshoots of more
Right.
progressive democratic socialists are saying tax everybody. If you want to leave, scram. We don't need you. And then you have other Democrats that are like, well, hold on.
Right.
And so
You're like, hold up a second. That's
Right.
I mean, yeah, we've got some like extreme spectrums there on that end. But from what you're saying, I think you're saying that Chris Corey almost has to go behind closed doors if you're a Republican and try to influence some of the moderate Democrats,
have
right? Like
to.
try to hold hands with them and say,
Yeah.
hey, look, like listen to me for
if
a
you're
second.
on the playground and you don't
Yeah.
have enough players to,
Right.
field a basketball court, you got to ask some people that aren't your friends. But one thing that's tough, right, is he mentioned, the only thing that I heard him mention was, hey, we gave $4 billion increase.
It's a lot. $4 billion, yeah.
I don't know how you take away money
Right.
from people you gave that to. That
Right.
seems like a real tough sell. And that was,
Yeah.
I mean, it was a brief
Because
conversation.
it's already done, right? How do you
Right.
how do
Just,
you take that back?
you
Yeah.
say, oh, just kidding. We need that money back. That would probably
Yeah.
cause a giant uproar. And so when you're in the position of a Zoom interview, you can say truly kind of whatever you want. It's
Yeah.
not something he's proposed. It's not on the
Yeah.
table. But one thing that is tangible is that's one thing that has at least been said. Because in Governor Ferguson's talks about how to fix the budget, all he said is we're cutting, but not what we are cutting.
Yeah, that's so we will see on that, and it'd be interesting to get clarification because what I did, and maybe you understand this from his interview because you directly talked to him, but from what I got from what he said was not necessarily that like let's go in now and take the $4 billion back, but I think he was given an example of when we could have cut that.
Sure.
Instead, they went ahead and did this, and so what he's saying is, and what the Republicans' talking point have been this whole time is they don't believe that it's a revenue problem because, and the numbers show that revenue has gone up. If you look at the budget of the state, it has significantly gone up in the last 10 years because people obviously we've grown as a state and we have more needs than 10 years ago. I get that. But what they're saying is, look, the budget has grown. So it's not necessarily a revenue problem. It's a spending problem. So you got two polar opposites talking about one side says it's a spending problem when it comes to Republicans. And the other side says, hold on, absolutely not. So I think it's just going to be a very interesting debate. It always is every year. So come 2026, when Olympia convenes again and lawmakers are back, this is just going to be a fight that's almost, I just don't see an end to it.
There's a lot of proposals on the table right now that I think a lot of everyday people will be interested in.
Yeah, it impacts all of us. Even
Yeah.
if you're not interested in politics, I think what the decisions they make in Olympia are so crucial because it really does impact everybody in some way or form, right? And even in this payroll tax, say you're not the CEO of Meta, obviously, but it will impact businesses in some way, that business. And then in turn, it has a trickle down effect on the employees and then other businesses. So I just think that all of it is somewhat connected. The question though is, will it actually cause companies to move? That is the big question. Are people saying that? Are they actually going to vote with their feet? What do you
What'll
think?
be interesting to see is if it even has legs. Just because Representative Scott stood on the steps and got
that's
some
true.
camera attention and got the reporters all riled up and asking hard questions,
yeah.
it might not even leave the floor.
Right.
But what is interesting is that he's getting attention. And
Yeah.
there are already articles about what Microsoft would do if this happens. And so when you start playing your cards early, so to say, maybe the businesses are already going to start making their decisions. And so
That's a good point.
we're
Like they're
talking about
closely watching kind of the talk that's coming out, like the tone
right.
that's being set.
Right. And so it's a really interesting game, and we'll see what happens because I
Yeah.
think everybody is a little nervous when it comes to the idea of raising taxes in any capacity. No lawmaker necessarily wants to say, well, we're gonna ask for more money, especially when you're talking about billions and billions and billions of dollars of budget and a deficit. That's something that I can't grasp. I don't think the everyday person's like,
Right.
how are you guys not able to afford this? We're giving you so much. And so when you start making these possible, I don't want to say threats, but when you start suggesting let's tax more, even if it doesn't happen, if I'm a business, I'm like, okay, let's figure out what we're going to do if this does happen. And so even if we don't see what we're talking about move forward, the effects might have already happened.
That you actually bring up a good point. So there is just so much to be said about what could come down the pipeline. I mean, we could talk about it all day, every day, but until we see it on paper, and it will come down. I mean, these lawmakers are going to be filing the legislation in the coming weeks, way before the session starts in January. So we definitely will have a lot of things to talk about. But yeah, I mean, I think anything else you want to mention about this issue before we call it wraps?
Yeah, I think we've already talked about it a little bit,
Yeah.
but this sometimes when it comes to what's going on in Olympia, it goes over a lot of people's heads. It even goes over my heads, and it's just so inside baseball. It's
Right.
like I have to know this law that passed. What this is coming down to, specifically this legislative session, is a lot of talks about taxes. And you said there is a Democratic majority in all branches.
Almost a supermajority.
Right.
Almost,
and
right?
so the questions that we're going to start wondering is, how does that impact me? How does that affect me? Whether it's where I work or whether it's what I take home, how I provide for my family or myself. These are the things that are really going to be a focal point, at least for me, as we move forward. There's going to be so many other things that are brought up. But how the state makes up this massive deficit is going to impact most people that live in Washington.
I think that this is not controversial to say because this is just, what everybody wants in life, I think, most people, is that they want to be able to afford things, right?
Yeah.
Point blank, I know, like, we can talk about all these
I was
difficult
expecting something
legislation.
bigger when you're like, this isn't
No,
controversial.
people just want to be able to, afford things, put food on the table, be able to save a little bit, right? I'm not saying anything controversial here.
No.
So at the end of the day, the problem for a lot of Washingtonians, and we've done stories day in and day out about this, about how Washington is so unaffordable. We're top 5 in so many things,
Everywhere.
right? Everything from gas to eating out. We were just talking about the eating out situation, to food, everything, right? Housing. People can't buy homes. So the cost of living here continues to go up. So I think the question is, hopefully lawmakers going into Olympia, is they're realizing that no matter what political side you're on, how can they work together to make it better for Washingtonians? I think simply that's their job, right? I mean, I'm not trying to be on a soapbox here, but that's what people want.
I don't disagree at all, but I think that's kind of just, unfortunately, how society is.
Yeah.
We want to be able to say, I work so hard, I can afford to live.
Yeah.
But that's not how it is for a lot of people, especially in the state. And I don't know if what we're seeing with a massive budget deficit and then the possibility of taxing you even more to make up for it is what is the final thing that's like, oh, here we are, or if it's something else. But yeah, I mean, all people really want is just to be able to go to work hard, and then come home and say, you know what, I can afford this. But that's not what a lot of people in the state have.
Yeah. I think the debate will continue. AJ, thank you again for coming on here, because I really thought you were the person to talk to, because you were there at the scene in Olympia, spending all day trying to dive into this issue. So appreciate your time.
Of course.
All right. And of course, remember, every Thursday, a new episode of Seattle News Weekly will drop. You can get it anywhere you get really your podcast, but also the Fox Local app. Don't forget that. And the fox13seattle.com website. Of course, you can go there and look for our podcast. All right. We'll see you next time.
Seattle News Weekly is available wherever you get your podcast.